All right, so before we get going here today, um, so just a couple housekeeping things. So we've got that Canvas discussion, so that's due at the end of the day on Monday. All right. I mentioned that Module 7 reading, although I think we'll start Module 7 today. Um, we'll really kind of focus on it tomorrow, so that is not due until the beginning of class or before class starts tomorrow. Um, we will kind of have a daily quiz today. I put it up under Module 6 because we're actually going to start with it, and it's kind of related to Module 6 material. So kind of next class tomorrow, we'll kind of have that daily quiz will be related to Module 7. I've got the practice problems up there. You can start reviewing those for the quiz, which will cover Modules 6 and 5. That quiz I will release today after my second section, so that is 3:30. And I think other than that, that should cover it for today. So we'll kind of be working through or using these Module 6 slides. We will then progress to Module 7 slides in this Excel file. Um, but other than that, that should take care of everything before we kind of jump into material. Are there any questions for me before we get started here? Okay. All right. So let's just start with this daily quiz. Okay. So I'm going to go here and make sure we have more than enough time today. All right. So once we start, so we'll go to return here and we'll start going through that first question. So there's actually only one question today. It's pretty involved. And so we've kind of got four parts. So I want to kind of go through this, right? So we've got an increase in job security. We also have kind of an increase in human capital. We're told that this job security change is larger than the increase in capital. So I kind of gave you hypothetical numbers, right? 10% change here, 5% change. Assume that we have a shift in both the long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply from one of these changes. We then want to know what happens to short run prices, if an inflation or deflationary gap will exist. We also want to think about um, going from the short to the long run. How is aggregate short run aggregate supply going to respond to what type of gap we have? And here we can kind of see the answers. So, we'll kind of work through these, but show why they are what they are. And then as a result, what's going to happen to future prices. Okay. So I'll probably answer a couple more questions along the way, just any types of questions we could be asked in a problem like this. Okay. So you can put these on the same graph. I'm going to do one, kind of work through it separately, and then show you what it looks like if we put them on one graph. So here, I've got my initial real GDP, or I've got GDP here, I've got prices, we have aggregate demand, we have long run aggregate supply, we have our initial, sorry, these are supposed to hit at the same point. Kind of drawing this quick. So this was our initial price, and this is our initial GDP. So the first thing we have is there's an increase in job security. So that was going to be one of the factors that caused aggregate demand to change, right? If more likely to have a job tomorrow, I'd spend more money today. And so we see an increase in our aggregate demand curve. Right? So what is this increase in the aggregate demand curve going to do? Right? Well, our new short run equilibrium would be where the aggregate demand, the new aggregate demand hits our short run aggregate supply. So that's going to be at a price that is higher. And that's also going to increase our real GDP in the short run. Okay. And we can think about this as like our short run price. So short run prices go up, or we have kind of inflation, and our short run GDP will also go up. Okay. Now, if we at the same time, so we're thinking about here, we've got aggregate demand. And this is where I got a question of, is it good to draw these out separately? I think so. To make some points about this. I'll probably put them on the same graph after we work through this problem, but I think the best thing is kind of to do this separately. So here we had our initial GDP and our initial prices. The second thing we had changing was an increase in human capital. So that increase in human capital is going to shift both our long and our short run aggregate supply. So when it comes to these questions, any changes in pull should shift both our aggregate and our short run aggregate supply. Okay. Now, I worked through some problems, I think, last class where what if it shifts long run aggregate supply more or less than short run? That was kind of leading us up to just some principles that I'll talk through more today. So the type of question I would give you on the quiz or the exam would be if there is a change in pull, you can assume that there's an increase in both the short and long run aggregate supply, and they kind of shift the same. So if this were to occur, where would our new GDP be in the short run? Well, it's going to be where the short run aggregate supply hits our aggregate demand. So we can think about what impact did this increase in both long and short run aggregate supply do? Well, it increased our short run, or sorry, decreased our short run prices. So these are our new kind of short run prices. It also increased our short run GDP. Okay. So this is kind of the combination of these two that we had for the short run. Okay. Now, if we think about instead, so if I was kind of interested first in what's the total effect going to be in the short run. Well, if they're pushing prices in opposite directions, we wouldn't know what's going to happen to the change in short run prices, but we can see here, we know GDP is going to increase. Okay. Now, even though we know it's going to increase, right, we could still determine if we have inflation or deflationary gaps. So first of all, in the short run, I know GDP is going to go up, right? However, what's going to happen to prices? Well, I don't know. However, I was told that that shift that was caused by job security, so that aggregate demand increase, was larger than the increase we saw or the change that was caused by an increase in human capital. So if that's the case, right, we now can say what's going to happen to prices because if this shift is larger, its change to short run prices will be the one that dominates. So we know that we're going to have prices increase. Okay. Or in the short run, we'll experience kind of inflation. Okay. Now, the second part is maybe a little bit trickier. Okay. So if we have this shift, right, and they're both increasing GDP, it gets a little bit trickier. Okay. So what's the impact of that aggregate demand increase on long and short run prices? Well, if that was the only thing that changed, our long run equilibrium is actually going to be up here. And notice our long run GDP, because we haven't had a shift in aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, it's not going to change at all. So we know that this is going to drive prices in the long run up, but it's not going to have any impact on our long run GDP. That long run aggregate supply increase, right? What did that do? Well, our long run equilibrium here is going to be exactly the same, right, for the short and the long run. So anytime long run aggregate supply shifts, that's going to cause the change in prices in GDP will be exactly the same. So here we've got decreases in long run prices, and we've got increases in long run GDP. So here, the only thing that changes is we don't know what's going to happen to long run prices in terms of are they going to go up or are they going to go down? But we can say what's going to happen to long run GDP. It's going to increase. Right? Now, because we knew that the change caused by aggregate demand was larger than that of the change in long run aggregate supply, similarly, we know prices would have to go up. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. So the only thing left that we have, so we know that that's going to be the directional changes. But what we're looking for, so we know that future long run prices will be higher. However, we haven't identified if there's a deflation or inflationary gap, and we haven't, determined what the response of the short run aggregate supply will be to that. Okay. So this is where I'm going to put this on this graph here, and I'm going to try to show you two different things. Okay. So here we know the aggregate demand increase is larger, right? But let's assume it's not, right? So let's assume we have a very small increase in aggregate demand. Well, when we have that aggregate demand increase, what will our new long run GDP be? Right? Well, in the long run, where does our new aggregate demand hit our new long run aggregate supply? It's going to be right here. So if we have these simultaneous changes, we know that the price level is going to go up, right? Now, what is our short run price? So it's kind of hard to see here because I drew this really small. But notice our short run price is going to be a little bit below that. And our new short run GDP is going to be a little bit greater than the new long run. So when it comes to the directional change, we're comparing it to the original GDP. When it comes to inflation or deflationary gaps, there we were talking about the relationship of short run GDP to the new long run GDP. Okay. So in this case, with a small aggregate demand shift, what do we see? So I think the setup was that it was larger, but I'm showing you it's actually not going to matter here. Because even if the aggregate demand shift was smaller, notice the short run GDP is going to be, where's our long run GDP? Right here. So it's going to be greater, in which case we know prices will respond by increasing to that long run outcome, or if prices are going up, we said we could call this an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, the reason why it doesn't matter is think about instead if I had this huge shift in aggregate demand. So we'll kind of call this the third scenario. Notice it doesn't impact the long run GDP. It'll impact long run prices, but that short run GDP will still be larger than that new long run point. So we would still have this same relationship exist. So it actually doesn't matter the relative size of the aggregate demand shift compared to the long run aggregate supply shift here. It does in terms of what's going to happen to the change in prices, right? Prices might end up being higher than they were before, but in terms of is there an inflation or deflationary gap, as long as we have this combination of aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply shifts, we always end up with an inflationary gap, right? Whether that demand shift was small or whether it was large. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? We've got one more part we need to answer. Now, to make sure you don't make cascading errors on the quiz or on the exam, I would then kind of tell you, regardless of your answer to the previous question, assume you have an inflation or assume you have a deflationary gap. So in this one, we know, because we're working through it together, that we had this inflationary gap. So if we have an inflationary gap, we could just think about where are we currently? Well, that means that we currently, if we look at long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, this would be the long run GDP, right? Sorry, yeah, this is our long run. So this is where we want to get to, right? This will be kind of our long run price and our long run GDP. If we currently have an inflationary gap, we know that currently short run GDP is too high, right? Economic conditions are good. So the only way that's going to happen in the short run is if the current, so you can think about this as like our long run aggregate supply. If our current short run aggregate supply is out here, that would give us a GDP in the short run that is greater than that long run outcome. So in the short run, our prices with an inflationary gap are actually too low. In which case, to get to that long run price, which once again, we know it's going to increase, which is why this kind of gave us this inflationary gap, right? We know that was true from the previous part of the problem. As a result, what are we going to do to the short run aggregate supply curve? We're going to see that it's going to it's going to decrease, right? Shifts to the left until our short run aggregate supply is the same as our long run short run aggregate supply, or we arrive at this long run equilibrium. So, and then as a result, that's going to increase our short run to our long run price. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So we should have our answers now to this problem. It should be increase in the short run prices, an inflationary gap. Short run aggregate supply is going to be too high, so it'll decrease. And as a result, that's going to increase our future prices or cause more inflation. So we can kind of get that submitted. The second thing that I want to kind of point out here is, nope. If we're looking at those module 6 slides, kind of glossed over this effect yesterday. So where are we at here? I need to find my slide. Okay, here we go. So I kind of glossed over this and was more focused on just the direction of the shift in short run aggregate supply. So what we could have is something that's going to impact short run, but not long run aggregate supply. So let's say I had there's really two factors that we have that are changing short run aggregate supply. So the first is going to be if the increase or decrease in input prices. So this doesn't change the amount of inputs that are available, raw materials, wages, or sorry, labor supply, that's all the same, but the prices of those factors is increasing or decreasing. Okay. So we have no change in pull. So we have no change in longer aggregate supply, but in the short run, maybe the prices of labor, right, or wages go up. So what's that going to do? Okay. Well, that's going to impact only short run aggregate supply. And then we'll kind of work through an example where also what's going to impact short run aggregate supply, inflation expectations. So remember, our expected real interest rate is whatever the current interest rate is minus this expected inflation. Okay. So we'll kind of work through an example where we have a shift in our short run aggregate supply and then think about how it's going to then change, right? So let's say, and I'll first just do a shift and then I'll kind of do a simultaneous shift with aggregate demand. So let's say initially we kind of start out, and I'm going to probably stop writing the axis just for the sake of time. Hopefully we know this is real GDP. This is prices at this point. So here is our long run aggregate supply. Here's our initial short run aggregate supply. So let's say we see, let's say the input prices go down. Okay. So this is opposite from the slides. Well, if wages, right, are lower, that isn't going to impact the amount of labor I have. So long run aggregate supply won't change. However, in the short run, because I'm having to pay those workers a lower amount, you can kind of think about it. Do I want to produce more or less than before? Well, I would want to produce something if the price that I could sell it for is above the price it cost me to produce it. If that price falls, there's now going to be some units where I wasn't producing them before, I now will, because now the amount I can sell them for, it's costing me less to produce them. So at any given price level, I'm going to produce more than before. So when input prices go down, my short run aggregate supply is actually going to increase or shift to the left. So this is going to be something, input prices, that only impacts our short run. So if this is the case, right, where is our new short run equilibrium where aggregate demand hits our short run aggregate supply? So here's my kind of short run price. Here's my short run GDP. So what did this change do? It pushed short run prices to be lower than before, and the short run GDP to be higher than before. Okay. So we had this increase in short run price, sorry, decrease in short run prices and an increase in short run GDP. Now, in response to that, we already said what's going to happen. Well, we currently have this as our short run GDP. Where would our long run GDP be? Well, aggregate demand hasn't changed. Long run aggregate supply hasn't changed. So our long run equilibrium will still be here. Notice our long run price and our long run GDP remain exactly the same. So what's that relationship of long to short run GDP? My GDP in the long run is less than my GDP in the short run. So that means short run GDP is greater, which means we have this inflationary gap. Okay. So what do we know is going to happen over time? Well, we know the current price level, going from the short to the long run, it's going to increase. Right? So if I expect prices to go up, what I'm really expecting is inflation. Okay. So if I expect inflation, right, when we're thinking about companies, that real interest rate is going to be the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. So here's where we want to switch our mindset from consumers to producers. Okay. If expected inflation, we think that prices are going to be higher, what does that do to our real interest rate? Well, that's actually going to cause it to go down. I'm subtracting a larger value. So when we think about companies, are they going to want to invest more into capital? Or are they going to want to make more investments? Well, when we invest into something, higher real interest rates are actually good. It was a bad thing for consumers or borrowers, but it's a good thing for investors. So what do these companies do? They start to invest less, which shifts, right? Doesn't change the factors of pull, but it will impact at the same given price level how much they're actually producing, and it decreases that short run aggregate supply until we get to this long run equilibrium. So if we have an initial change in input prices, that's going to then cause changes in expected inflation. So that increase in short run aggregate supply over time, it's going to return to that long run level. Okay. Any questions on this idea? I'm going to complicate it a little bit more here. Let me take a drink real quick. So what might be a little bit more difficult? Let me see here if I have. So I think I left this actually off the slides. We were just focusing on long run changes, but you could have a short run change as well. So what is this going to look like? So let's assume we have this same setup, right? That we know input prices are going to go up. Okay. Or I think, sorry, I had input prices going down. And we said the result of that, short run aggregate supply increases, which drove our short run prices down and our short run GDP up. Okay. So this is where I would draw things out on separate graphs, because if at the same time, let's say we have, oh, I don't know, an improvement in exchange rates. Well, an improvement in exchange rates, we said is going to shift what? Our aggregate demand. So if I have kind of my long run aggregate supply, if I then just isolate the effect of this aggregate demand shift, well, I know that the kind of long run price or sorry, the initial price and the initial GDP will be here. But with that aggregate demand increase, what's going to happen? Well, relative to my old point, my new short run prices will be here. My new short run GDP would be here. So this aggregate demand increase caused my short run price to go up and my short run GDP to also go up. Okay. So in the short run, if these things happen simultaneously, what is our total effect going to be? Right. Well, I've got here kind of thinking about these things happen simultaneously. So what's going to happen to prices in the short run? They're pushing them in opposite directions. I don't know. But they're both pushing short run GDP up. So I know for sure short run GDP is going to increase. Okay. Now, if I have GDP increasing, right? Um, what's going to be the impact of that, right? Well, if short run GDP is increasing, we said that when these shift, nothing is happening to long run aggregate supply. So in terms of GDP, our new aggregate demand is hitting long run aggregate supply up here. So our long run prices, because of this aggregate demand shift, will be even larger. However, the long run equilibrium is where our new aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply. We won't have any change in long run aggregate supply. Why? Because the only thing shifting long run aggregate supply is factors of pull. Okay. So in the long run, what impacts did this aggregate demand increase have? It's going to drive prices up. It's also going to cause GDP in the long run to not change at all. Okay. Now, if we go back to just our short run aggregate supply change, the short run, right, prices and kind of GDP will be out here. But the long run, once again, there's no change in prices and there's no change in long run GDP. So if we then kind of think about the long run, what is that impact going to be? Well, I said that the increase in short run aggregate supply, prices in the long run, it's going to not change them at all. And then GDP in the long run, it's going to cause that not to change at all. So what do we know is definitely going to happen in the long run? So this is kind of my total effect in the long run. Here was our total effect in the short run. We know that prices are going to go up, and we know that GDP in the long run is going to remain the same. Okay. So our long run change, it doesn't matter which of these effects is larger. It only matters in the short run. Okay. So in the short run, to know what's going to happen to prices, I would need to know which of these effects is larger, the aggregate demand increase or the input price decrease. If aggregate demand shift was larger, then its impact on prices in the short run will kind of be the one that dominates. If the input price change is larger, its price would be the one that kind of dominates in the short run. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So in response to that, notice what did we say? So here's where the size of the shifts doesn't matter. When we're looking at inflationary or deflationary gaps, we want to compare the short run GDP to the long run GDP. Well, we said here, regardless of the size of the shifts, we know we have short run GDP going up and we know long run GDP stays the same. Okay. So if that's the case, right, we know that our short run GDP will be greater than that long run GDP, in which case we know that we're going to have an inflationary gap. Okay. And we said we know prices are going to have to increase to get to that long run level. because of that aggregate demand change. But notice that short run aggregate supply change also means that prices have to go up in the long run. So we have an inflationary gap. We know that the GDP is too high. We're then going to see what in response to that. We said anytime there's an inflationary gap, what happens to our real interest rate? Well, this is our nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. So if we have an inflationary gap, we are saying that the GDP is too high, price level is too low. We expect prices to increase in the future. If this increases, decreases real interest rates, companies make lower investments, short run aggregate supply then decreases until we get to that long run equilibrium. Okay. So the size of the shifts matters for short run prices. It doesn't matter for long run prices or long run GDP. And so we know that we're always going to have an inflationary gap, and we should always then see the response to that be a decrease in short run aggregate supply. Okay. So I know this stuff gets tricky, right? We could have simultaneous changes in a factor of pull or a change in long and short run aggregate supply simultaneously. We could also then have a change in aggregate demand. That was kind of the problem we worked through first. Excuse me. But when we have just a change in short run aggregate supply and just a change in aggregate demand, we're always going to know if we have an inflationary or deflationary gap. When we had changes in long run aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply, there, whether or not we had an inflationary or deflationary gap mattered on kind of the relative size of those changes. Okay. Another way of thinking about this, and this is where I think it's helpful to do kind of draw these two effects out separately like we just did. Because let's say I had a scenario like this, and maybe not, maybe this will help some people think about this more than others. So here our kind of initial price levels and our initial GDP were right here. So I'm going to draw these effects on the same graph. So we had a what? Increase in only short run aggregate supply. And then we had a increase in aggregate demand as well. So let's say for a second, we've got a really small aggregate demand increase, right? It's much smaller than that shift in short run aggregate supply. Well, where will our new long run point? It's our aggregate demand. So we can kind of think about this is my long run kind of GDP, and this would be my long run price. Okay. So the current level in the short run, my price would be where aggregate demand hits my short run aggregate supply. So in the short run, I could see that prices go down, but I know that in the long run, they'll increase back to this equilibrium point. So if GDP currently is too high, right? So we had GDP in the short or the long run is less than our GDP in the short run here. We've got an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, what if instead, if I had drawn this out and I didn't know the relative size of the changes, well, let's say I drew a very large change in my aggregate demand. So aggregate demand goes up by a lot here. Right? Well, what's going to be true, right, is our new equilibrium will actually drive prices instead of down, it's going to drive prices up, right? So here, if I have a larger shift in aggregate demand, I'm going to see current short-run prices go up as opposed to down. Okay? So here, drawing out larger or small shifts matters in terms of what's going to happen to short-run prices. It's also going to cause my real GDP in the short run to also increase. So notice here, doesn't matter the size of the aggregate demand shift relative to the short run aggregate supply shift. I always know that real short run GDP is going to go up. So I always know that relative to my long run GDP, which doesn't change because none of the factors of pull have changed, I know that that's always going to be less than my short run GDP, in which case I'm always going to have this inflationary gap. So the relative size of the short run aggregate supply shift and the aggregate demand shift doesn't matter. Right? I'm always going to, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in terms of will it cause an inflation or deflationary gap, right? So whether either of these effects is larger, so in this third scenario, where would my long run price be? Kind of up here. So in both cases, I know that whatever the current short run price is, that to get back to that long run point, I'm going to see prices go up or I'm going to have inflation and it's an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, the relative size did impact what's going to happen to prices in the short run. Okay. And that's where drawing them on the same graph might be a little bit misleading in terms of what happens to prices, which is why drawing them out separately and then kind of using these arrows to see which direction these changes are pushing short run and long run, sorry, short run prices and short run GDP, or long run prices and long run GDP, there the relative size mattered. Okay. But in terms of will this combination cause an inflation or deflationary gap, it doesn't matter. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. Um, so one thing I do want to mention, so I've got this in the slides, but I won't push you this far. We talked about examples last class where maybe the long run aggregate supply shift was larger than the kind of current short run aggregate supply because it takes factors time to adjust. There, the relative size of the long run to the short run aggregate supply shift kind of mattered. I wouldn't give you a question like that. I'm going to isolate this to giving you a change in the factor of pull, in which case you would shift long and short run aggregate supply the same amount. Or I would give you not a change in the factor of pull, but just a change in input prices, which would then just shift your short run aggregate supply. So I'll make that part a little bit easier in terms of questions on the quiz or the exam. So this slide here, this would not be something I would ask you. No questions on that before we keep moving here. Kind of keeping an eye on time. Okay. All right. So before we move, let me make sure there's nothing else I want to say here. Yeah, so these are kind of some more, this would be kind of what I ask you on the quiz, right? I have the same shift in aggregate, long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply. Here was just a point where I showed the price could not change if those shifts were exactly the same. But in like the problem that we just worked through, the relative size would then kind of dictate what our short run and long run prices, whether they go up or down. Okay. All right. Any questions before we move on here? Once again, I know this is a tough module, which I wanted to, which is just why I wanted to spend a little bit more time kind of working through this. Any questions over anything? Anything I didn't go through, a different combination that we could see here? Okay. So we got 30 minutes. Let me see if there's anything else I want to do before we move on here. I don't think so. So if we have time tomorrow, maybe I'll come back to module 6 just to do a little bit of review. I think we'll probably get through module 7 completely tomorrow, in which case we'll have next Monday and Tuesday's class to do the final module, which would be module 8, and then that second exam will be next Friday. Okay. So instead, let's move to, no, I don't want that. There we go. So we'll get out of module 6, kind of start module 7. And I have this Excel file pulled up, which is for module 7 as well. Okay. So here, if I've got, jumping into the next module, let's think about what happens, right, if we have kind of disposable income changes. Okay. So let's say that GDP or gross domestic product changes in the short run. If there's no taxes or depreciation, right, then we can think about maybe some increase in consumption or an increase in savings. This drives up disposable income. Okay. So consumption is kind of defined as the spending on new goods and services. So that could go up or down. We'll kind of think about the impacts of what that would be. So this could be, maybe we have, we have changes in prices such that it leads to higher consumption spending, given the same amount of real income, or sorry, the same amount of gross income, we kind of see this change in real income. I can buy more or less than I was before. So saving is income that we wouldn't be using on consumption. Excuse me. So if we see increases in savings, given the same disposable income, we would have to see consumption goes down. Okay. So this would be if we consume, I say consume, if we put more money into savings account, mutual funds, or housing. Okay. So I think this is all that we have in these slides. Oh, what do I want to do here? Oh, that's not the case. So I have aggregate expenditures. What do we want to do here? So what I want to do here is we're looking at module 7. So we're looking at aggregate expenditures. We talked through this. So what's going to happen? Oh, I want to add something here that I think will help. So let's go through some examples here. So I've got my module 7 stuff here, and think about where am I at here? So results here. We kind of worked through this example. Next thing we'll go through is, what did I do with my? It doesn't matter. We can work through it from here. So let's do. We already worked through the quiz. I'm going to go back to modules here. We're now going to look at kind of module 7. So we'll kind of open up these slides. This is what I'm kind of working through. Oh, where did I have them? Sorry. There we go. So can you see the screen? So can you guys see the module 7 slides here? I want to make sure that you can.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. It's not popping up for me for some reason. So what do we want to work through first? So let's say, before we get to thinking about what these changes are going to be, so we'll go, here's kind of module 7, all right? So we'll kind of take a different kind of approach here, and thinking about what is our disposable income, okay? So if we've got disposable income, right? Here, this is going to be the overall, sorry. Sure, I worked through the examples that I had here. That's not what I wanted. Sorry, I had put this somewhere other than what I wanted. No. So let's say instead we jump into kind of module 7 here, switching gears, right? So I think here I've now kind of have this new definition, which is we can think about this relationship of an increase or decrease in disposable income and how that's going to impact our models in terms of what is our current long or short run GDP. Okay. So if we have no taxes or no depreciation, what's going to happen? Okay. So I know I had something drawn here that was going to be helpful. I can't find it. I want to make sure that I'm going to do things that will be helpful. So we're going to have this definition of disposable income. So whatever my income is, right, that would be the current level of GDP if I have no taxes, right? So consumers aren't paying any taxes and the things that they own have no depreciation. Right? So we can think about disposable income. It's going to have however much I'm consuming, the products I'm consuming, but part of that income is going to come from or kind of be spent on savings. You can almost think about this as two different goods. So consumption is physical goods, savings are like these financial goods that we're buying. So the sum of those two would be our disposable income. So we'll kind of notate this with Y subscript D. Consumption kind of work through some examples here. So savings accounts, mutual funds, that's all savings, food, iPhones, what we would call like non-durable goods. Okay. So this is things that will kind of go away over time or depreciate over time. There we go. So what if we do have taxes or we do have depreciation? Well, then the actual income we have to spend on products would be whatever income Y we have, or the GDP in the economy, minus these taxes, or minus depreciation, or minus our current debts. So whatever we kind of start out, you can think about this as GDP or income. The amount of income or disposable income we have left to consume products will be whatever that is minus taxes, or minus the depreciation, or minus the debts that we have. Okay. So once again, we can think of Y as GDP, T is taxes or debts. So our disposable income will be GDP minus debts. And then if we're thinking about like at the individual level, if that helps, whatever your actual income was, you then have to pay taxes. That's how much left you have. That's how much you have left over to spend on products. Okay. So I don't know. I think it kind of helps then to think about my total income is what I'm spending on consumption and savings. However, I can't spend things on consumption or saving products if part of that I have to pay in taxes. Okay. So this is kind of our definition of disposable income. There we go. Oh, come on. There we go. So when we think about aggregate demand, we said it was C plus I plus G plus net exports. So what's going to happen to aggregate demand if we see increases in income? Okay. Well, if I see increases in income, that should change consumption. But part of consumption, right, we said was, well, I'm going to have to pay taxes or I spend money on savings products, right? So we're going to have that as my income increases, right? So how much is how much money am I actually spending would be whatever income I have times some factor. We'll talk about what this will be in a second, plus some additional amount. So we don't know the slope and we don't know the constant yet. We know Y is the actual level of consumption. X is the amount of available funds we have to spend, and then B will be some constant. So when we want to look at disposable income, right, we said in the previous slide that was my actual income minus taxes. Okay. So we can kind of plug these things in to kind of think about what our actual consumption level will be if we see an increase in income. They won't be one-to-one. So if we think about Y, because part of our income, right, is going to be spending money on these consumption goods, part of it is going to be in savings, right? We're not going to buy any products. We're just going to put this money aside, if you want to think about it that way. So we can calculate average average propensity consume, or the APC. So that's what ratio of my income that I'm consuming products. And then APS, or average savings, you can think about it this way, is my savings divided by that amount of disposable income. Okay. So I can think of an example here just to kind of use some nice easy numbers. If I've got disposable income of 50,000, I've got consumption or the products I'm spending 40,000 on, and I'm putting $10,000 aside. averages should be relatively easy to calculate. The disposable income. So if I was thinking about my example here, oh, hold on. Oh, I got something in the chat here. So we should disregard the complex. So, sorry, I didn't see this until after the fact. So let's go back to module 6 here. So when I'm thinking about these complex models, I won't give you something like this, right? Where you have differences in the change to long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply. Any factor of pull I give you a change in, it's going to shift both of those by the same amount. Now, I could give you a question where you do have a factor of pull changing while simultaneously you have a change in aggregate demand, but you would just kind of draw out what that long run and short run aggregate supply shift, they would have the exact same impacts. And then a second type of question would be like the other one we worked through, which is, I don't even think I have it in the slides here. I'll add one in just to be helpful. But there we had also problems where I can just see a change in short run aggregate supply combined with just a change in aggregate demand. In which case we were kind of thinking about, where there we could have inflationary or deflationary slash recessionary gaps, depending on the relative size of that aggregate demand shift to whatever that short run aggregate supply shift was. Is that clear there? Okay. So we'll go back to module 7. Um, so we've got, how do we calculate these averages? So this shouldn't be too bad, right? When we think about calculating these averages, if I give you a level of disposable income, and I told you in this example it was 50,000, we have that, of that, I'm consuming products and spending 40,000. The amount of money I have left over that I'm not spending or I'm setting aside in savings is 10,000. So average propensity to consume and my average propensity to save, it's just going to be whatever my consumption is over my disposable income and whatever my savings are divided by my disposable income. So in this example, I would have what? 40,000 over 50,000, which is 0.8. And I would have 10,000 divided by 50,000 is equal to 0.2. Now, oh, I knocked some things over, disregard that. So if I have the average propensity to consume and the average propensity to save, notice, what do these add up to? They would always add up to 1, right? So why is that the case, right? If I write this out, I would have what? Consumption over disposable income plus savings over disposable income. But remember, so we've got the same denominator, so I could think about this as consumption plus savings divided by disposable income. We said consumption plus savings is my disposable income, so this would always be equal to 1. So if you calculate these averages and they don't add up to 1, you know you made a mistake. Okay. Any questions there before we move to kind of the next concept? So what about marginal propensities to consume and marginal propensities to save? When we're thinking about marginal, we're thinking about the change in. So when I think about the marginal propensity to consume, it's what is my change in consumption divided by whatever my change in disposable income is. So if I make 10,000 more dollars, I might not spend all of that on consumption. I might put some of that aside into savings. So my marginal propensity to save is going to be, or sorry, before I get to that, another way I'll write this just to point something out is, instead of use the word change, kind of algebraically, I'll use this kind of delta or this triangle that represents the change. Okay. And then if I'm thinking about my marginal propensity to save, same kind of setup, but it's the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income. Okay. So these two things don't necessarily have to add up to one like we had with the averages. Okay. So here I'm going to come up with, actually, sorry, that's not going to be true. They actually will also add up to one. So I can have this question in here. They should always add up to one. And we'll show why here in a second. So let's say I had these two kind of years, and I've got my consumption, my saving, and my disposable income in both years, right? So if I wanted to calculate this marginal percent propensity to consume and my marginal propensity to save, what would I do here? So this is where I want to think about, move this over. So let's change the view here so we can see this a little bit easier. Here's 200 going to be too large? No. So I'm kind of leaving this blank. I'm looking at this blank worksheet. I have the completed version here in a second, but let's kind of build this out in Excel. So if I currently have no money, but I'm consuming, right, $6,000 approx. Well, how would I do that, right? I would have to borrow money, in which case my savings are actually negative 6,000, right? Because if I'm borrowing money, that's like negative savings. So I could then calculate kind of my marginal propensity to consume and my marginal propensity to save here. Now, these are all the same values. I'll show you why these change in a second because we haven't put anything here, right? So let's say that disposable income goes up to $6,000, right? If I were to keep consumption the same, right, I think is that what I want to do here? No. All right, what do I want to do? I want to show you changes in, okay. So let's say my marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, my marginal propensity to save is 0.2. So this is one I want to kind of get here. I can't calculate averages with zero disposable income because remember, averages I was dividing by my disposable income, dividing by zero is undefined. Now, if I think about instead, I've got disposable income of $6,000, right? Well, when I was borrowing 6,000 to spend, my old consumption was 6,000. I would then add to that, what is my new disposable income? However, I'm not going to spend all of that, right? My marginal propensity to consume here is 0.8. So whatever that change in income was, right, my change in consumption won't be all of that, right? So maybe a different way of thinking about this is when I see this change in income, what will the change in consumption be? So thinking about how we calculate these marginal values, we said the marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption divided by my change in disposable income. So here we had an example where my disposable income changed by $6,000. The amount or my marginal propensity to consume that we were given was 0.8. So this would be something that you'd have to be told. What would my change in consumption be? Well, it's just a little rearranging of this equation. So I'll do it in kind of general terms, and then we'll do it with the numbers. Okay. So if I had this set up, this equation, how would I solve for that change in consumption? I multiply both sides by the change in disposable income, right? And that would give me that change in consumption. So here I've got what is my change in disposable income times that marginal propensity to consume. That would tell me what the change in consumption was. Now this is a change. So when my disposable income goes up, I would take that change in consumption. And if I want to figure out what my new, sorry, if I want to find out what my new consumption levels are, that's going to be my old consumption levels plus that change in consumption. So my new consumption will be my old consumption prior to that change in disposable income, plus how do we get that change in consumption? That was my change in disposable income times that marginal propensity to consume. So we're going to use this equation to figure out when we have these changes in our disposable income, what is our new consumption level going to be? Right? So I go back to my Excel file. we said the new consumption would be whatever I was spending before. That was kind of C2 here. But then I would add what's the change in my disposable income. Well, it went from 6,000 to 0. So instead of just selecting 6,000 here, I actually want the change in my disposable income. It went up by 6,000. However, I didn't spend all of that, right? My marginal propensity to consume was only 0.8. So of that additional $6,000, I only spent 80% of that, right? Or 0.8. So my new level of consumption would be $10,800, right? In which case, what is my savings going to be? Well, my savings will be whatever my kind of new disposable income is minus however much I'm consuming. So notice here, I'll change this to negative, which is fine. I don't think I had this. So the formatting is a little bit different here, but kind of when it puts it in red, this is going to be a negative value. So what do I want here? I want to change, oh, where's my format? Yeah. No, I forget what this is at. No, there we go. And I'll add in, no, it's not that. Hold on, sorry. No, we'll keep it here just to make this easier. There we go. Don't want it to be negative. Well, I forget how to change this formatting now. We'll kind of keep this for right here. So this is going to represent, oh, I know what I can do. Sorry. There we go. So there I've kind of got, well, now I'm consuming 10,800. However, I still have that 6,000 in savings, right? So that amount that I'm putting into savings has now fallen, right? Because I had that initial loan. And then really, as I copy this down, I've got the same marginal propensity to consume. I kept this nice and easy where the change in disposable income was always 6,000. So this change will always be 6,000. I multiply that by the marginal propensity to consume, and then always add in whatever my consumption levels were before. So I could copy these two down, and I get kind of my new consumption and my new savings levels. Okay. So if I had this, what is my average propensity to consume? Well, that's going to be my current consumption divided by my current disposable income. Right? And then my savings would be whatever my savings are divided by my disposable income. So notice here, these averages add up to 1. I can copy these down and see the averages always add up to 1. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay, so we can kind of build this entire kind of sheet out here. So this is what I have in the second worksheet. So we're going to blow this up. Got those same values. And what we can see here is the actual level of income that I have, right, or my disposable income. If I put that on the same graph as how much I'm consuming, notice the actual consumption, right, is less than my disposable income because I had this negative savings starting out, right? I was kind of taking out this loan. So there's going to be a point where I actually end up with my consumption is the exact same as my disposable income. So in that case, I would have savings of $0. That's what we would call kind of our break-even point. So that's the level where my consumption is no longer less than my disposable income. It's equal to 0. And at any point past that, my level of consumption starts to be less than that disposable income. Okay. And this is because my marginal propensity to consume is not 1. If this was 1, right, I would kind of have the same slope here. And what I'm consuming, right, would always be greater than whatever my disposable income was. So kind of go back to this example. So that's how you would kind of calculate average propensities and average to consume and average propensities to save. Now, I was just giving you point 0.8 here. How could you actually calculate that? So remember, I technically couldn't find my marginal values here because I have nothing to compare to. Oh, actually, I would have to, sorry. I'll build these out here. So this is different ways of calculating these. Oops. Sorry, I won't. There we go. You can't calculate marginals at the initial value. So we said our marginal propensity to consume would be whatever the change in consumption was divided by the change in disposable income. Notice that should give me that 0.8 value. And if I wanted my marginal propensity to save, that was the change in savings divided by a change in my disposable income. Oh, I forgot a parentheses here, didn't I? That would give me that 0.2. And then if I did that here, I should always get those same values. Okay. So I get the marginal values. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So we got a little bit more time here just to kind of set us up for tomorrow. So this. So let's think about what the marginal propensity to consume is telling us. So if I have my disposable income, right, that's how much money I have to spend on consumption or what kind of level of income I have. I'm not going to spend all of that, right? In fact, we said we're only going to spend whatever our marginal propensity to consume, that like ratio of that or that proportion of the income. Now we'll talk a little bit more. I don't think maybe we'll quite get there today to kind of dive into it too deeply, but B is going to be some level of overall consumption I have, even if I didn't have disposable income. So this was the idea in that Excel file. When I had no income, I'm going to borrow right there. I need a certain amount of goods to stay alive, or I have to purchase food. And so if I don't have any money, I'm going to start to take loans out, right? So I can purchase food and things I need to stay alive, right? So here, we're thinking about why D represents disposable income. We're going to have some slope and we're going to have a constant. It's kind of our general just formula, right? Usually we'd be like Y is equal to MX plus B. X here is our disposable income. Y is our consumption level. So what is our slope going to be? Well, the increase in consumption that comes from an increase in disposable income, or that change in consumption from a change in disposable income, that was our marginal propensity to consume, right? Change in consumption over a change in disposable income, that's our marginal propensity to consume. So we can think about what our current consumption levels are whatever that kind of constant, what we'll end up calling autonomous consumption, right, is plus whatever we're spending of our increase or our change in disposable income. Okay. So this is going to be our equation that we use to calculate consumption, actual consumption, because people don't spend all of their income. If they did, what would be true? Well, if we spend all of our money on consumption, that marginal propensity to consume would have to be 1. Okay. Another way of thinking about this, if I can get my mouse to come over here, is if I had a function where I've got consumption is equal to my marginal propensity to consume times my disposable income plus some constant. Well, if I took a derivative of this, I'd have the change in consumption from a change in disposable income. So if I take a derivative, the derivative of a constant is nothing. The derivative in respect to disposable income, that change in my the change in consumption from a change in disposable income would just be whatever my marginal propensity to consume is. Okay. if I wanted to complicate this a little bit more, what's another way I could write this? I could also think about, I don't think I have this in the slides, but it's maybe helpful to think about. What's another way I could write my marginal propensity to consume? Well, we said that's always going to add up to my marginal propensity to consume, and my marginal propensity to save should always add up to 1. So here I could rewrite this as 1 minus my marginal propensity to save. These two things should be giving me the same value. Okay. So setting us up here, if I can get this, here we go. I could actually, we built out that entire table. I kind of showed you how we could calculate averages. We could also calculate those marginal values if we are instead given these numbers, or if we're given the marginal propensities, we could then back out what real consumption or real savings actually was. Okay. So when we have this graph, we said initially consumption might be greater than disposable income. Eventually, we could lead to, we eventually see disposable income as less than, or sorry, greater than consumption. So here to kind of give us some more definitions. If we have consumption exceeding our disposable income, well, that means that of the money we have, we're consuming more products than the money we have available. We must be borrowing money or we have negative savings. As soon as our consumption levels, right, fall below what our current level of disposable income is, that means that we must be putting money aside, right? We're not consuming all of our income, so we would actually have positive amounts of savings. And then our autonomous consumption, I kind of already described that constant is basically what we would need. I don't know. I always think about this as like what you would need to survive, right? And so that's going to be, even if I had zero disposable income, this is the amount of money I'd have to be spent, products I'd be consuming in order to kind of have my basic needs met. Okay. So we're going to use this equation for consumption. And then on a graph, we could think about when consumption is greater than my disposable income, we've got this savings. If what I'm consuming, right, is in fact, sorry, if my actual consumption is in fact less than my disposable income or what I could be consuming, there we must have a level of savings. Okay. And then there's this break-even point in the middle where all of my income, I'm spending exactly all, right? All of my disposable income, I'm spending all of it on goods and services. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to hit my ear there. So there we would kind of have no savings. Okay? I'm spending all of the money that I have available. So we will kind of pick up on this idea tomorrow, where we then think about, okay, how can I find this break-even point? What's the level of disposable income I would need in order to have no savings? And then we'll kind of continue to kind of move through the rest of module 7. So for today, I finished up module 6. Like I said, I think we'll be able to get through all of module 7 tomorrow. Module 7 is going to be a lot more algebra, using actual functions, as opposed to like module 6 was a lot of directional changes. So just kind of be prepared for that. That module 7 reading due before we start class tomorrow. Excuse me. And then after class today, after my second section at 3:30, I will also post that third quiz. So you've got the practice problems. That's over just module 5 and 6. So I'm going to end the recording here. If you have any other questions, I'll kind of leave Zoom open so you can kind of ask them. Oh, there we go. So let me stop this recording.